Welcome to the Clearground Show. I'm your host, Dr. G, with a PhD. It was a busy week for news this weekend, and we're here to break it all down for you guys. So first of all, we're going to talk about the new COVID variant that I discussed at the end of last week. Then we're going to discuss federal vaccine updates, and that's for federal employees as well as federal contractors, and what the due dates are for those vaccines. Then the Lancet has a extremely unique correspondence letter, the first of its kind that I've seen, and I'm excited to break that down for you guys. We'll take a look at the massive protests breaking out all over Europe and Australia in defiance of the new COVID-19 mandates. We'll take a look at California's new COVID policies and see if that's going to be the future for the US or if that's just going to be in California. We'll touch a little bit on New York. I've got a fun story from them. We'll take a look at a brand new study coming out of the journal Circulation and how that might add to the vaccine debate. So finally, we'll take a look at Dr. Fauci and his statements on children below the age of 5 and toddlers getting the vaccine by early 2022. I'll be juxtaposing Dr. Fauci's statements with the CDC numbers. We'll compare and contrast who's getting COVID, who's dying from COVID, and this will hopefully allow everyone to make their own risk calculations on whether or not they should vaccinate their children and themselves. That's a lot to get to, so let's dive on in. So we're going to look at a couple of news articles about the new COVID or the new Delta COVID strain, and it's really more of a sub-strain. This first article comes from the Glasgow Live magazine, and well, for starters, it says that people who are becoming infected with the new COVID-19 strain are less likely to display symptoms in comparison to other variants such as Delta. This was actually a predicted scenario, with most virologists tending to agree and suspecting that SARS-CoV-2 is going to follow a similar evolutionary trajectory to the 4 endemic coronaviruses that cause the common cold. So back to Glasgow Live, the AY variants of the virus are considered a sublineage of the Delta variant, with 75 AY lineages identified so far. As a matter of fact, 63% of new cases in October were caused by AY.4. According to CBS News, AY.4.2 has been spotted in at least 8 states in the US. CBS is quick to note that scientists have already discovered several of the sublineages in Delta, including AY1, AY2, and AY4.2, and these are commonly and interchangeably known as the Delta Plus variants. Glasgow Live was more broad in their COVID case delineation, and they just stated that 63% of new cases in October were caused by AY4. Now, the CBS data is saying that in the UK, AY4.2, so more specific than 4, has climbed to more than 11% of cases of the Delta variant. So this should be considered some promising and excellent news, honestly, as it shows that COVID, for now, is trending to a less lethal variant. Now we're quickly going to touch on federal contractors and federal employees and see what the vaccine deadlines are for them. This is coming out of SHRM. Federal contractor employees must be fully vaccinated by January 18th, 2022. So this requires vaccinations to be completed by January 4th to be fully in effect by January 18th. And I'm quoting from the paper or from the article. Federal contractor employees must have received the second dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccinations or the one dose of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine by January 4th, 2022. So the White House was explicit in saying that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS, will also fall under these guidelines, and they're expected to have their second dose of Pfizer or Moderna or a single dose of Johnson & Johnson by January 4th, 2022. The saferfederalworkforce.gov website has instructions for federal employees for vaccination. I am assuming this page is up to date, but according to this page, the federal employees need to be fully vaccinated with proof by November 22nd, 2021, which would be today. Now, this requirement is also extending to employees that are full-time remotely working. At this time, it's unclear what, if any, disciplinary actions will be taken on employees that do not decide to get the vaccine at the allotted times. So now I'm going to discuss a really short correspondence article that was published in the Lancet on Saturday, November 20th. And the title of the correspondence is COVID-19 Stigmatizing the Unvaccinated is Not Justified. So you could probably read this correspondence in 2 minutes. It's really short. I'm just going to highlight 3 quick parts from it, starting with the author, Gunter Kampf, stating that there is increasing evidence that vaccinated individuals continue to have a relevant role in transmission. Now, we've seen even the CDC admit this, so this is common knowledge at this point. That being said, the second thing I want to highlight is him explaining how exactly we go about understanding this. Kampf states, cycle threshold values were similarly low between people who were fully vaccinated and people who were unvaccinated, not fully vaccinated, or those whose vaccination status was unknown, indicating a high viral load even among people who were fully vaccinated. Now, he uses the term cycle threshold, so I'm going to define that term for you guys. The cycle threshold value is just the number of cycles necessary to spot the virus. And the way that they spot viruses is using the PCR machine, which is a polymerase chain reaction. And those machines stop running at the point they detect the virus. So if a positive signal is not seen after 37 to 40 cycles, the test is negative. Now, Kampf ends this correspondence letter by saying, he calls on high-level officials and scientists to stop the inappropriate stigmatization of unvaccinated people who include our patients, colleagues, and other fellow citizens, and to put extra effort into bringing societies back together. I wholeheartedly agree with this correspondence letter, and in a rather serendipitous fashion, several of the countries that we discussed on Friday are having large protests happen against the mandates, the vaccine mandates that are happening and the lockdowns that are happening. Now, here's a compilation of videos of protests from different countries that I saw over the weekend that I put together for you guys. This is a big deal. These are some big protests, and I hope governments are getting the picture that lockdowns are not working. Lockdowns are not going to prevent the spread of COVID. We've shown it many times on this show that lockdowns do not correlate with a particularly effective strategy in mitigation of COVID. So good for these people, and I hope the lockdown measures cease as soon as possible. Now we're going to go into talking about a couple of states, and we'll start with New York. So we'll start off with some ostensibly good news from the New York Times. Fully vaccinated people will be allowed in Times Square for New Year's Eve, the mayor said. That's Mayor de Blasio. Anyone unable to prove they're vaccinated because of a disability will have to show a negative virus test. Children under 5 must be with someone who is vaccinated. Now, I'm not sure why in this tweet they didn't just say children under 5 need to be with an adult. But I guess if they're with someone who is vaccinated, that's more important than being with an adult. Anyways, a couple of highlights from the article itself. I'm going to quote Bill de Blasio now. We want to welcome all those hundreds of thousands of folks, but everyone needs to be vaccinated. Join the crowd, join the joy, join a historic moment as New York City provides further evidence to the world that we are 100% back. Now, if you decide to go and you're not vaccinated for one of the correct reasons, you're going to have to wear a mask. But they don't actually describe what kind of mask, so it's all fair game. Now, I personally really want to see this happen. I really want to see hundreds of thousands of people together, no masks, celebrating the holidays with their families and their friends and cheering on a new year. I love this stuff. Now, I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical for a few reasons. Let's take a look at the New York COVID data right now. So all this data comes from COVID eSTEM, and this is a program online. It's free to use, so anyone can go to it. Links posted at the bottom. And it's from Yale, Harvard, and Stanford Medicine. And it basically tracks COVID in real time and shows lots of cool COVID stats. So here's the latest data from New York taken at the end of last week. So first we'll look at that R sub T value, and it's 1.08, and it's the color red. So R sub T is the effective reproduction number. The effective reproduction number is just the average number of people who will become infected by an infected person at a specific time. If the value is greater than 1, then the COVID-19 cases are going to be increasing in the near future. And if the value is below 1, the COVID-19 cases will be decreasing in the near future. So with a value of 1.08, that's indicating that COVID cases are on the rise. Now, if we look at the actual effective reproduction number trend, they're predicting the trend will start bending down, which is good news. But that's the prediction. We'll see what actually happens. Now let's look at the cases. So first look at the cases in general since the very beginning of COVID. And you can see that in January of 2021 and February, the spike was super high. There were a bunch of cases then. It's never been that high since. Now let's look more locally at the fall of 2021. Here we can see the case levels rising actually above the Delta peak, which happened in the middle of September, end of August. This is not necessarily bad news. If it's the Delta AY 4.2 variant, then significantly less people are going to die. So this is just the case count. This is not the hospitalization count or the death count. So finally, for the New York data, we'll take a look at the infections per capita. Now, this is the software's best estimate as to how many individuals will get infected every day, and this includes infections that are never going to be diagnosed through testing and are never going to manifest in testing data. The units are in cases per 100,000, and if you look at the trend on the far right of the chart, which is modern time, which is right now, it looks to be trending upward, and again, that's based partially on the R sub t value we talked about earlier, but it looks like it's going up. Now, all of these values and cases have me concerned about the New Year's Eve party because Bill de Blasio is definitely a type of character to shut everything down if cases get to a certain point. We have no idea what that point is. It's particularly arbitrary. So New Yorkers, look out for that. But I really, really, really hope you guys get to celebrate with a big New Year's Eve party, and I think it's going to be fantastic if that happens. Now let's move from the mayor of the Big Apple to the governor of California. This article coming from the SF Gate newspaper. The title of the article is Why Gavin Newsom Extending the COVID-19 State of Emergency Matters. So first we'll start off with comments from the Health and Human Services Secretary, Dr. Mark Galey. Galey says that the governor's office and the state's health officials do not have case, vaccination, or hospitalization thresholds that would determine when the emergency declaration could be lifted. That is to say, the only metric for a successful response is whatever they say it is at whatever time they say it is. Galey continues by saying that even if the emergency declarations were lifted, many of the mandates in effect statewide, including the school mask mandate and vaccine mandates for various sectors, would remain in effect as they were issued by the California Department of Public Health, which has the power to implement sweeping policy even in the absence of state emergency. He alleges that this statement is supported in the California's Health and Safety Code in the provision stating that upon being informed by a health officer of any contagious, infectious, or communicable disease, the department may take measures as are necessary to ascertain the nature of the disease and prevent its spread. Just as is that's so open to interpretation, I wish that these governors and these state departments had justifiable explanations for each step. For example, they cite papers or they cite studies. They indicate how far they're going to go. And if they have to go farther, they indicate why and give several reasons. But instead, it just seems kind of whatever they want is what they're going to do. Now, of course, in typical Newsom fashion, the governor has extended his state's COVID-19 state of emergency declaration through March 2022, which means he will have had emergency powers for at least a full 2 years. Now, over the summer, when asked why he was extending California's emergency declaration, and that was this past summer, his response was, quote, "This disease has not been extinguished, it's not vanished, and it's not taking the summer months off." Well, if zero COVID is the goal, California better get used to this because this is going to be the status quo for a long time. Before we leave California, we have to just quickly check in on their students, especially their students from K through 12. If you recall, California was the first, and I believe is currently the only state mandating vaccinations in this age group. This article comes from the Los Angeles Times. LA schools will relax some student mask rules, ease COVID-19 testing, what you need to know. So in a brief update on vaccination status, so far about 71.9% of students 12 and older who are mandated to be fully vaccinated by January 10th have had at least one vaccine dose or have otherwise complied with the district's vaccine requirement, said the school board member Jackie Goldberg, and this was based on an internal briefing. Well, at least if you're vaccinated, you can take your mask off, right? Well, maybe not. In January, students at middle and high schools, where the vaccine mandate will be in force, will no longer have to wear masks outside. The same will hold for elementary schools, where 85% of students are vaccinated. Students ages 5 to 11 recently became eligible for vaccination, but the district is not extending its mandate to them. So all students and staff will continue to wear masks indoors. Wow, it's just incredible. If you're not living in California, if you're living in other states, can you imagine being forced to be masked outside, running around on playgrounds? It is the epitome of insanity. But California is still doing it. And can you imagine being thankful for being allowed to take your mask off to play outside? It's unbelievable. I'm going to break down the stats for children in COVID in a little bit, but let's go to the next story. So this abstract was published in the journal Circulation, and the title of the abstract is mRNA COVID Vaccines Dramatically Increase Endothelial Inflammatory Markers and ACS Risk as Measured by the Pulse Cardiac Test. So just quickly before going over the abstract, Circulation has an impact factor of 23.6. Now, impact factors are how they rank journals. This ranks as the first among the journals in cardiac and cardiovascular systems category. All right, so now let's go over the abstract. So this group has been using the PLUS cardiac test. This is a clinically validated measurement of multiple protein biomarkers, which generates a score and that predicts your 5-year risk of a new acute coronary syndrome, and ACS is the shorthand of that. They go on to describe that the score is based on changes from the norm of multiple protein biomarkers, including interleukin-16, soluble FAS, hepatocyte growth factor, HGF, and several others. There's a link in the description if you guys want to learn more about the Pulse cardiac test to the Pulse website. So this Pulse score was measured every 3 to 6 months in their patient population for 8 years. So in this study, they had a total of 566 patients between the ages of 28 and 97. The male to female ratio was 1:1, and they were seen in a preventative cardiology practice with a new pulse test drawn every 2 to 10 weeks following the second COVID shot, and this was compared to the previous pulse score 3 to 5 months prior to the first COVID-19 vaccination shot. So the results indicated that several of the protein biomarkers increased significantly from their normal levels. And so the change was so much so that it resulted in an increase of the pulse score from an 11% 5-year ACS risk to a 25% 5-year ACS risk. They closed by noting that these changes persisted for at least 2.5 months after the second dose of the vaccine, and they concluded that the mRNA vaccines dramatically increase inflammation to the endothelium and T-cell infiltration of the cardiac muscle and may account for the observation of increased thrombosis, cardiomyopathies, and other vascular events following vaccination. So why is this important? It's important because it adds to every individual's risk calculation for getting the vaccine. If you look at COVID and you look at your comorbidities and you look at the rest of the risks in your life, this can help add to that calculation and let you make a more informed decision. So with that, let's talk about what Dr. Fauci has to say about toddlers and the vaccine. I'm reporting to you now from The Hill. The title of the article is Fauci says babies and toddlers could be eligible for COVID-19 vaccine by early 2022. Now, though he can't guarantee it, Dr. Fauci opines that babies and toddlers aged 6 months to 5 years can be eligible for the COVID-19 vaccination by spring. This statement goes hand in hand with a statement that Pfizer made stating that the results from their clinical trial in children in age range of 2 to 5 and 6 months to 2 years are expected as soon as the fourth quarter of this year. According to a report in ABC Tampa, Pfizer expects to apply this month for approval for its COVID-19 vaccine in children ages 6 months to 5 years. So according to CNN, Pfizer is the furthest along in trials for those aged 6 months to 5 years. Moderna is also conducting studies in very young children. Finally, the White House notes that this was on Wednesday, that 10% of children ages 5 to 11 have received their first coronavirus shot following the approval of the Pfizer pediatric dose. That's 10% of 28 million, so around 2.8 million children. Now, for the last few minutes of the show, I'm going to briefly try to explain why I think this is insane, the rate at which they are pushing through these emergency use authorizations for children in this vaccine. Now, all those statistics and numbers I'm about to use come directly from the CDC, and they're the most up-to-date numbers I could get. The link is in the descriptions. So first we'll take a look at deaths, and these are deaths from COVID according to the CDC, and that number sits at 765,320. I've created this donut graph to break it down by age, and it goes from 0 to 85 plus. Now there is a tiny, tiny hairline of a note right at the top of the circle, and that represents ages 0 to 17, and that's less than 1% of all deaths in the US up to this point from COVID-19. So I zoomed in to the 0 to 24 year category so we could break down those numbers because it's really hard to tell when it's less than 1%. So within that 0 to 24 category, 10% of those are made up from the under 1 year to 1 to 4 year group. 9% are from 5 to 14. The rest, the other 82%, are made from the ages of 15 to 24, with many of those being above the age of 20. So the next thing I decided to do was look at COVID-19 deaths compared to all the deaths that occur in that age range. So that's, if you take total deaths for age 0 to 4, and then you take how many of those are COVID, that's what I did here. And you'll find that it's 0.42% for the babies under the age of 1, and for children 1 to 4, it's about 1%. Now, that's not normally how it's presented to us. Rather, we usually get COVID-19 deaths as a percent of all COVID deaths. So if you're a senior citizen, if you're above the age of 85, you're making up a really good chunk of COVID deaths. But if you're a very, very young person, let's take a look at those numbers. If you're under 1 year old, you make up 0.019% of the COVID deaths. 1 to 4 years old, even less. You're making 0.009% of COVID deaths. So this is what's really crazy to me. So children, and I've discussed this many times before, we're not entirely sure why, but their immune systems are rock solid against COVID typically. 605 deaths total have been attributed to kids ages 0 to 17, with many of those deaths occurring alongside comorbidities. Now, before the Delta surge, I believe approximately 40% of children ages 0 to 17 have been exposed to COVID, showing some kind of positive result, and I can only imagine that number shot through the roof in August during the Delta peak alongside kids going to school. So with the huge rise in cases, there was an increased number of deaths, but you have to look at it relative to everyone else. And the peak number of deaths, if you look at ages 0 to 14, which is how they break it down here in the CDC, it fluctuates between 0 and 8 on any particular day. That's not nothing, and every death is a tragedy. But when making drugs, you have to weigh the risk of the serious disease versus the drug and the risks coming from the drug. Nothing is free. Everything has risks. And in this case, I think it's more than reasonable for parents to be skeptical. Now, I'm not saying to make a decision one way or the other. I'm saying you should consult your pediatrician, you should consult your doctors, and look at the data, and then make an informed decision. But I think it's reasonable as a parent to say, you know what, I might want to hold off on giving my kid this particular vaccine. Again, it's all about risk calculations, and it's always okay to have questions. Now, as always, I hope this leads to reasonable discussions with your friends, coworkers, and families. And with that, we're going to call it a day. Thank you guys for listening. If you liked it, please subscribe, share with your friends. Let's keep this channel growing. Have an excellent Monday, and please enjoy this video.